Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the broadcast. I am your host, Professor Christian Jardine. Our guests on the show today will be William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt as a younger man, and Alfred T. Mahan, who you may not be too aware of. So join me, if you will. We'll be talking about American expansionist foreign policy and imperialism, 1890 to 1920, after this commercial message. So Dissent, Depression, and War. We didn't get to the war part, so that is what's up next. Imperialism. We need to get some sort of definition of what this means. Looking at the middle of the screen, you see my very broad working definition. We could get more nitpicky, but we don't need to. So let's suffice it to say for now that imperialism means when one country, usually a larger one, dominates the politics, economy, land, labor, resources, decision-making to some capacity or more of another country, usually a smaller one, a less powerful one. Otherwise, the relationship wouldn't be in this direction. So with that definition, there are two types of empire, and we'll see both more or less in the coming slides. Formal and informal empire, both. So the more typical or more well-known kind of empire, a long time ago, decades and decades back, scholars only identified one type of empire, so they just called it imperialism or empire because there wasn't a designation between two, so no need for the term formal then. But now, with informal empire being finally noticed, and thought of as empire just in a different way. So now there are two kind of categorizations. So the formal type, the type that we are familiar with more often than not, is when a country, the more powerful one, dominates and controls, colonizes another country, establishes a formal colony, and governs that colony, that part of the world, that country, that kingdom, that people. They send out administrators, they send out governors, they send out troops, they send out police forces, they send out civil servants and bureaucrats, and they rule that people, that country, directly, annexing it, as they say. If you annex a colony, it means the British Empire, to take an example, is now formally governing the people of India and India itself. So a formal type of empire, the formal type of empire, means direct, hands-on, everyday control. Informal empire is a bit more subtle, and in this formulation, the more powerful country controls all the things that we see above on the screen, but they do so without sending in troops, without governing on an everyday basis, without planting the flag, without imposing their own currency on the other people. They do so from afar for the most part, usually having one or more employees of the government, an agent, kind of the equivalent of an ambassador on the ground in this capital or that. And that agent, maybe, and their staff are all that's needed to exercise the type of control and get the decisions in their favor that, again, we see above in the definition of imperialism. So how does this work? It's usually by threats, coercion, and it's usually of an economic nature in informal empire. So the agent can be called upon by the home government. Let's just say it's the British, again, as an example, though we're talking about American empire. But the agent in, say, Afghanistan at the height of the British Empire, which is around this same time period, might be called upon by his government to talk to the leaders of Afghanistan, and he, of course, will get in to see them, no doubt, because they know who he is. They know he's the representative of Great Britain, the more powerful country in this relationship. And he might be sent to say something, deliver a message, and he'll do it politely, because everyone knows that there's a threat underlying. So he can and probably would be as polite as possible, probably being invited in for tea to meet with the president or king of whatever country it is. and they're, they probably exchange pleasantries and ask about how their families are because they probably met many times before. They know each other a little bit, and the agent or ambassador, diplomat, says politely again, yes, Her Majesty's government would like it if you opened your country up to more of our corporate penetration, allow more of our businesses to do, buying and selling here in this country. And everybody in the room knows that however much things are said calmly and with smiles and with courteousness, that if the government in question doesn't comply, that the British or whatever colonial or imperialist power we're talking about will possibly get rougher and tougher. And what sometimes happens through the course of empire in the 19th century, somewhat before that too, is if a country, a kingdom, under this kind of pressure finally decides not to go along, and this happens sometimes, where a king or a president or a government says, you know what, we can't go that far. We've bent to every one of your demands, but this is a step too far. We're not willing to go. We're going to break with you. Well, then the likelihood is that situation is going to turn into war, and troops will be sent out by the home government, the British, the French, the Americans, to get what they want, first of all, which is the sort of the corporate opening of corporate interests in the country, but then also likely, or at least possibly, putting in their own governor and taking steps to move to formal empire or formal control of that country. So informal is a way to do this without all of the fanfare, because there's only one agent or a small number of people. So the populace in the country that's being leaned on doesn't even realize, for the most part, I mean, some may, the degree to which the imperialist country is in fact calling many of the shots, because they don't have a presence there. And the benefit of informal empire extends in that sense all the way back to the home country as well. The people of Great Britain, the public, doesn't necessarily know to what degree their country, their government is involved in Afghanistan or wherever it may be. It's also cheaper to do it the informal way as well, because you're granting, you are allowing to continue formal independence for that country. So the president and his government in that locale is still passing the laws. It's their civil servants, their bureaucrats that are employed to run the government. The police force is theirs. They have their own flag, their own currency. So it's much cheaper if you can just do the informal version. And this is why, in many cases in the history of imperialism, we see informal empire being sort of the starting point, the starting version of empire, and then sometimes gradually morphing into formal for the reasons mentioned above. It doesn't always happen in that direction. There are cases where it goes the other way as well. We'll get into that. And some stay formal or informal throughout the entire duration of empire. But if there's a move, it's usually from informal to formal. We need to talk about internationalism versus expansionism or isolationism. And this is going to be important going forward in our class, because the conflict between, let's just call them internationalists on one side and isolationists on the other side, expansionists, is a rough synonym, not exactly. So we're going to see these terms come up again and again and again. So think of it this way. There were, I'm simplifying, but there were two schools of thought on foreign policy in America. The more traditional one was isolationism, which meant that the United States has a limited foreign policy. It doesn't get embroiled in foreign affairs unless it absolutely has to. This goes all the way back to the beginnings of the Republic and George Washington's first presidency, where he put the nation on course to a neutral policy with regard in particular to wars in Europe. Washington's thinking, which I believe was solid, and his administration's, was that the United States at that time was a baby, brand new nation, and it had to spend all of its time, money, energy, resources in making sure that they consolidated power and made the United States work. The country couldn't afford to get involved in expensive, often ruinously expensive wars amongst the European powers. So this was kind of the start of what became isolationist policy. The United States, of course, also has always had the advantage, still does, of being isolated geographically. All right, two huge oceans, east to west, that protect it from invasion. Not 100%, but it's hard to invade across two oceans. And north and south, of course, the United States is somewhat vulnerable then and now, but the U.S. took measures, both economic, diplomatic, and military, to sort of close off any threats from those directions as well. And part of that we're going to be talking about in this very lecture. So the isolationists are still around. They're still powerful in 1898, just to pick the centerpiece of our lecture here, the Spanish American War. And there are lots of isolationist members of Congress, but there's a rising group of politicians and Americans who support one side or the other in this conflict, or some don't have a side, but the internationalists. And they come along really during this period for the first time, make the first splash, and it makes sense that it would be here at this time, because this is the first time in American history, the Gilded Age, when America really was a world power, at least economically. And what the internationalists are saying, and will say consistently, is that the United States, as a major economic power in the world and a growing military power, must have a foreign policy commensurate with its power in those other areas. So a powerful country, the internationalists say, cannot have an isolationist foreign policy. It just doesn't make sense, doesn't work that way. We have to, first of all, protect American interests overseas. A lot of that means corporate and business interests, but it can be argued then and now that such forward foreign policy protecting corporate interests is also in the interest of American consumers and American citizens for national security reasons, but also for economic reasons. So the internationalists come around at a time that you'd expect, and start saying we have to break out of our more limited foreign policy. It's the only way. But this battle between the two will go on for decades. So, and there's a tug of war. They go back and forth in terms of who gets the upper hand. We'll see that even in this lecture. And it's not really until after World War II that the internationalists get the firm upper hand. Even then, there are still a minority of isolationists in Congress, so the school of thought is still there. But from that point forward, up until just very recently, the internationalists or expansionists had continued to hold the upper hand. Things have changed a bit in the last several years. I wouldn't say we're an isolationist country now, but the internationalism, which we could now call globalization, has been under fire, as I'm sure you know, for a number of years now. Lastly, turning the Caribbean Ocean into an American lake. I'm going to skip that for now because we have a slide later on that will go into more detail on this. So, as we're in the habit of now in this unit, from the first part on dissent and depression, we see my red-lettered questions. So why empire and a more assertive foreign policy? Well, really, the answer is in the internationalist position that I just talked about. So a growing number of leaders believe that with the rising economic and political diplomatic power of the United States, military power, comes the necessity of a more active, assertive American foreign policy. There are some other reasons too, which we'll answer either directly or tacitly in what follows. The American Secretary of War through much of the period we're talking about, Elihu Root, said at one point, we do not take them for ourselves, meaning colonies or other countries. we do not want to take them for ourselves. He said, we do not want any foreign nations to take them for themselves. We want to help them. So here's it's a great quote, partly because it tells us a great deal about American thinking. The internationalists, much of the time, not always, some of them, not all of them, believed that not only was an internationalist more expansionist, aggressive foreign policy in the nation's interest, some of them actually were so idealistic, and you might say arrogant, to believe that it was in the interest of the people being conquered, the people being brought under the control, whether formal or informal, of the United States. So, and that attitude has had a long shelf life. It's still around to some degree. It's been more and more discredited in recent years, but it's still there. That we want to help them. We're not just doing this for ourselves. We're trying to bring sort of American know-how, American success, and the American way of doing it to other people. Now, I think it's obvious or easy to see how that idea expressed by Root and many others since is open to criticism. It certainly is arrogant and makes America look pushy and bullying, which it has in much of its foreign policy from this point forward. But I think it's harder to see that Root may have actually had a point. Certainly sometimes leaders who made this kind of claim were doing so to make for propaganda reasons, to make foreign policy look nicer than it actually was. But I think you might be surprised to find how many leaders throughout our history as well that have actually believed this and have actually strived to make good on it. Whether or not it can happen, whether or not by forcing yourself formally or informally on another part of the world and their people, with good intentions can actually turn out to benefit them is another story. Although it's still debatable either way, but the intent by Root was probably sincere, and I know it was in at least some leaders' cases. Moving next to the intellectual context for American expansion, and I'll ask the question off the top this time, can books really affect the real world? I love to deal with this question in one way or another, any chance I get. I have a bias, of course, as a professor, as a voracious and addicted reader of serious books. My answer, of course, is yes. But I think the actual answer is yes, whether I'm biased or not. And this is one of many places where we can see it. So the foreign policy that we're talking about, the extended foreign policy that we're talking about here, didn't just come out of nowhere. As we said, part of it was the Industrial Revolution, Americans' rise to the top as a major economic player in the world, but also at the same time, and partly because of that, there's kind of a mutual reinforcement going on here between the intellectual changes and the economic changes taking place. Nonetheless, these books and others, these are just two of the most famous, had an impact, I think, in moving thinking, at least in the internationalist camp. John Keegan, a British military historian, recently deceased, one of the greats in that subfield, said the guy on the left, Alfred T. Mahan, one of our featured guests today, said that he was the most important strategist of the 19th century. He really meant military strategist, implying that. So Mahan became famous and a sensation almost instantly when he published his book, The Influence of Sea Power on History, in 1890. And he sort of went back and surveyed, going way back in history to 1660, how much of an advantage having a powerful navy gave certain countries. Now, of course, you have to have coastline to have a navy, so some countries like Switzerland couldn't exercise this kind of power. And Mahan was aware that having a strong navy wasn't the only way to exert power in the world, but he thought it gave huge advantages. H.W. Brands, who I've quoted already in this lecture, says, modern navies of steel and steam were expensive and slow to build. Their support systems were even costlier and slower to construct and required a revolution in attitudes towards international affairs. Mahan's histories revealed the costs of failures to prepare. Americans must adopt a 20th century outlook, as he called it, one anchored in the best navy the country could afford. So Mahan's survey of sea power in history, world history, led him to the conclusion that the United States is sort of in a similar position to other sea powers and could potentially become a much more powerful country. And if on the other side, if it doesn't become more powerful by creating a large and powerful navy, it could be under threat by another country that does pursue that path. So in Mahan's case, he had a direct impact because Theodore Roosevelt, another one of our guests today, his colleague and fellow internationalist, who also meet Henry Cabot Lodge and others, got to know this guy because they loved what he was doing. Mahan was actually a naval officer himself, as well as an intellectual, so he actually became one of the more powerful and influential of the internationalists because of this book, but he got kind of invited into the halls of power by Theodore Roosevelt and the circle surrounding him. On the right, we see Frederick Jackson Turner and his famous book, which is first an essay, called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, published in 1893. It turned into a book, slightly different name, just afterwards. And Turner was a professional historian in the same field as me. He's one of the most famous of all time and one of the most influential of all time. He lived about the same time as Mahan on the left, but his impact on foreign policy and a more expansionist foreign policy was a more indirect one, because his book wasn't about foreign policy per se. It was about the frontier, the West in American history. And what Turner said, the Turner thesis as it's come to be called, was that the American value system, everything that made America a sort of special country in his and other Americans' mind, American exceptionalism as it's sometimes called, was due to, or most of it was due to, what happened on the frontier in the West, which was turning traditional, conventional history up until that time inside out or around, because the emphasis had always been on the East Coast, New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, the original colonies on the East Coast. It was assumed that what was happening on the East Coast was more important than on the frontier. Jackson totally turned that around and said, no way. And the reason is an interesting one. It's certainly arguable, and his thesis has basically been rejected for good reason, I think, overall in more recent decades. But nonetheless, it's an intriguing argument. What he said, more or less, was that the frontier has always posed so many challenges. Americans were moving the frontier further and further west. Each time it moved to a new place, which became the frontier, replacing the last frontier, because now that's behind the frontier line. It's already settled. It forced Americans to think, forced them to be creative. It forced them to sort of always be innovative, and to the pressure, the difficulty of frontier life forced them to sort of into new ideas, and sort of kept the American value system about rugged independence, individualism, freedom, and so forth, fresh. And he wrote this essay and the subsequent book partly in response to the 1890 census put out by the U.S. government, which said that the frontier had closed. The frontier's no more. Every part of America that's habitable is now filled up with enough people. There's no more frontier. And so Jackson then was in some ways writing this essay / book in lament of the end of the frontier, but also suggesting, sometimes, again, without saying it, sometimes at least hinting at it, that this could have repercussions beyond the continental U.S. He said, for instance, just one sentence, but it's a rather intriguing one. American energy will continually demand a wider field for its exercise. from the frontier essay, from his thesis. So, meaning that if the frontier is gone, Americans' tendency to want to expand out into a new frontier is going to continue, but it'll have to continue somewhere else. And if it's taken up, if there's no frontier in the continental U.S., it'll have to go overseas. It'll have to go to another country in order to expand and to, American energy essentially will be unstoppable, at least in that sense. So, as Alfred Maclay, in a very interesting overview of American history in one volume, says, his thesis, Turner's, is often read as the quintessential example of optimistic, forward-looking, triumphant American exceptionalism. The factors that shaped American development were now gone. To save the republic, people would have to look elsewhere, or people would have to look elsewhere for new frontiers to conquer outside the continent. So this, then again in a more subtle way, was sort of also influencing at least Americans among the educated and professional classes, politicians and otherwise, in thinking about the frontier, what it meant, what might happen after it's actually gone. Theodore Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as it's usually known, in some ways set the tone for this binge of empire building that happens during the Gilded Age and somewhat beyond. Theodore Roosevelt is probably the star player in our lecture today because I'm not making a value judgment, good or bad, about Roosevelt, but he's just sort of at the center of the action much of the time. There'll be a number of slides with him on it. His domestic policy as president, we'll get to in the next unit. But he's one of our more significant presidents, whether you like him or don't like him. He had a huge impact, again, whether good or bad. So in Roosevelt's message to Congress in 1904 as president, he talked about chronic wrongdoing, which may, in America as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. Civilized is, in this case, as it often is, used as a derogatory term for other peoples, not the United States or like Great Britain or Europe, that are sort of seen to be by Roosevelt and others as uncivilized. So there's a prejudice certainly in this, but it was common at the time, unfortunately. So he announced this in his annual message and went on to say, and in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, the adherents of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the U.S., however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. And that idea of the United States as a police, a world policeman, kind of a globocop, has been around ever since. So this is a very influential statement, and this is this piece of a larger statement is what's known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. What was the Monroe Doctrine? Well, it said something similar to this way back in 1823. The Monroe administration and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, had made a statement that more or less told European powers at the time to get out of the Western Hemisphere. This was, the timing was partly because the Latin American nations were in the middle of wars and struggles for independence against Spain and the European powers, many of which ended up being successful in the end, achieving independence. And the United States was going on record saying that the United States supports those revolutions for freedom in Latin America, although the subtext, and I think the real message was what Roosevelt is talking about here, which is that we're going to control affairs in the Western Hemisphere. North and South America, Europe's not going to dominate any longer. You don't even have a say any longer, Europe. We're going to take charge here. So this was, in a sense, reminding the world that the Monroe Doctrine already exists, and Roosevelt in some ways is kind of dusting it off and bringing it back to life again. Roosevelt is a fascinating figure in our history, and again, we'll talk somewhat more about him in our next unit, but I kind of divided up between the two units. This is one of my favorite quotes by a president, and he was talking about the criticism that politicians like himself and others get, and I think this in some ways still applies today. Not that I'm not saying that presidents don't deserve criticism. It's a free country, and it's important with a free press and freedom of speech that we hold our leaders accountable. So we should always be willing to criticize them when it's necessary, when they deserve criticism. But I do think there's something to be said on the other side, and Roosevelt's kind of making that point here. He said, famously, "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." So Roosevelt's, in a sense, defending leaders having to make sometimes difficult decisions and, sort of being targets, easy targets for criticism, but that it should be never forgotten. He's saying that those people are in positions with great pressure on them, and if they don't rise to a challenge, which sometimes requires some risk-taking, then they never get anywhere. So they have to risk, and the good ones, and he, of course, included himself in that category, do take risks and sometimes fail because of it, but that's the price to be paid, even with good leadership, good and bad. There's sometimes going to be failures. American involvement in Cuba and the coming of the Spanish American War. This is kind of the centerpiece of the lecture today. All of the expansive American foreign policy that's taking place in this era is centered by the Spanish American War. So the red letter question, why did Americans get so passionately involved on Cuba's side? Why did they care so much? So we have to kind of unpack this a bit. Why is it called the Spanish American War? And then I ask a question about Cuba. Well, Spain at one time in the 16th century had a huge, vast empire in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America both. But Spain's power had declined, and by the latter part of the 19th century, this era, Spain only had an empire consisting of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. That was it. And Cuba was the one part of Spain's remaining empire that was close to the United States, about 80 miles or so south of Florida. And the Cuban people, not surprisingly, having been under the imperial control of Spain for now centuries, had risen up time and time again to try to throw off the yoke of Spanish power, proclaim and achieve independence. But they had failed, but they were kind of at it again in this period. One good book on empire recently states, modernity, the modern world, tested the faith of the Cuban people, and during the latter part of the 19th century, insurgents raised the banner of Cuban independence. Again, one 10-year war for independence ended in failure in 1878, but a generation later, a new crop of insurgents joined some of the old ones, and in 1895, another war of liberation began, which resorted to guerrilla warfare, using sabotage, ambushes, sporadic raids. The Spanish army responded with harsh policies on the populace at large. The nightmare would have made headlines in American newspapers on its own, but it received crucial help. The insurgents, meaning the rebels, the freedom fighters, the slogan Cuba Libre, but they established a propaganda bureau in the U.S., which fed stories to the American press. So this ended up being a crucial link between the Cuban freedom fighters and the American public, because it's through the press, in those days newspapers, that Americans started to learn more and more and more about the Cubans' fight for freedom against the imperial power, the imperialist power, Spain. And of course, you may already see this, but Americans tended to, still do in many ways, have a soft spot in their heart for people fighting for their independence, unless they're communists. We'll get to that later as well in another unit. But and the main reason is, of course, the United States was born in a struggle for independence, a famous one, which in some ways is one of the defining stories of our country. You could say call it a myth, though there were real events, the American Revolution. So Americans have always had a soft spot for people rising up for their independence. So Americans do get passionately involved on Cuba's side, mainly because for that reason, and because it's close to home. They're learning about it more easily because it's only 80 miles away. After Americans, I'm skipping some events here, but after Americans got increasingly involved and started putting pressure on President McKinley and the government to take a more active interest. Some corporate interests did the same, though American businesses and the corporate world were divided on whether or not the United States should get involved in Cuba against Spain. Even some supporting an eventual war, some being horrified by the prospect of war. Some historians, by the way, have claimed, historians of a certain persuasion, Marxist historians and so forth, have often thought that the war came about primarily, or at least in big part, because corporate America was pushing for it to expand American markets, etc., financial interests of banks. But it's just much more complicated than that. Some corporations, some business leaders supported a war, or at least more, aggressive involvement of the United States, in favor of Cuban independence from Spain. Others did not. But the key kind of turning point in what was becoming a crisis, with America starting to be slowly kind of getting more involved in Cuba, with Spain as its antagonist, supporting the Cuban freedom fighters, though not at war yet, was when an American ship, the USS Maine, a naval ship, more or less a battleship or a cruiser, was sent to Manila Harbor and exploded in the middle of the night on February 15th, 1898, killing 266 American servicemen and wounding hundreds more. This in Havana Harbor. Who did it and why? Question mark, question mark, question mark. We'll come back to that. As Adam Burns, another historian of imperialism, says, the incident was among the most evident causes of war in 1898. The Maine had been sent to Havana to protect U.S. citizens and interests during late 1897. So there were some American citizens in Cuba. This is part of the reason the government is getting more involved, though certainly not the only one, and some corporate interests, as already mentioned. Following this incident, Burns goes on, an even fiercer urging from the press, the pressure mounted on President McKinley to act, with fiercer urging from the press. So from this point forward, really the turning point, Americans who were already intrigued and paying attention, and certainly emotionally invested on the side of Cuba against Spain, wanting to oust Spain, whether the United States was involved or not. From this point forward, the pressure for America to intervene in a more active and aggressive way, possibly including war, becomes intense. And some leaders, like Theodore Roosevelt and his cronies, were almost immediately after this pushing the president to get involved in a war, to declare war, push for, again, much more aggressive action. But the press played a huge role in this. And can actually be then seen, I think rightly, as a cause of the war itself. So the press and the way it went about its business, especially the penny press, was very influential. So the question at the top, can the media actually influence political decisions? I think you know the answer to that is yes, though I still think it doesn't dawn on us that often, at least people that don't study this for a living like I do, how much this is actually the case, and how deep the influence actually is. In this war, it's a bit obvious. Sometimes it's not as obvious, but this is one of the reasons why it's good to study this particular series of events, because it is more obvious, and if you can see it in one place more obviously, then at another point in history or currently in our current world, you might be able to then start to see the same kind of patterns that aren't as obvious, wouldn't be as obvious if you hadn't learned this in a more straightforward way. What role did capitalism play? Another question there. The two major media moguls involved, big time players in American media, which was basically newspapers at the time. William Randolph Hearst on the left, the Hearst Castle, if you ever visited that, that was his mansion, and Joseph Pulitzer on the right. The kind of up-and-coming challenger was Hearst, younger, and the older, more established defender, kind of champion of his own media empire, Joseph Pulitzer. And these two got involved in intense competition to sell papers and to make their newspapers more successful and more profitable than the others. And when the Spanish American War, or before that the Cuban struggle for independence that led to that war, they saw opportunity here because Americans were interested, and their stories about Cuba, about Spain's atrocities, and the heavy-handed way in which Spain ruled Cuba, started to get into their papers more and more and more. And so there's kind of a, again, mutually reinforcing relationship between the public and the newspapers. The public already is interested in Cuba, but then as more and more stories are hunted down and put into the papers, front page, on an increasing basis by these two editors and publishers, then it gives Americans even more sort of emotional, knowledge, more push to get involved. As Adam Burns, I just quoted, says, one major cause of the war was the so-called yellow or sensationalist journalism propagated by the two editors just mentioned and their New York-based papers. In a bid to sell papers, both publishers reveled in the shocking stories that emanated from the Cuban Revolution and actively sought the harrowing details Cuban sympathizers were so willing to supply. The editors sent famous writers and artists to Cuba to cover the Cuban conflict, the first in U.S. history to be covered with both still photography and moving images. Coverage, especially from Hearst papers, came to increasingly favor U.S. military intervention. Hearst at one point saying, as you see at the very top of the slide, to one of his journalists or photographers, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. And in some ways, it's true. It's not accurate to say that the newspapers here in question caused the Spanish American War by themselves. That would be monocausal, and historians reject monocausal explanations, and rightfully so. So it's not just one cause that explains any war, any event. Nonetheless, the press, these two media moguls, I think, played a large role in bringing about the war, because they, in competition with each other, to sell papers, to make money, and in Hearst's case, because he seems to have actually believed that this was a major cause worthy of fighting for, not just to make a profit. He's pushing very emotionally laden stories in order to sway public opinion in the direction of war against Spain on behalf of Cuba. And his statement at the top certainly shows an arrogance on his part, but it also, I think, shows the confidence and maybe the reality that he could actually follow through on this and use his influence by putting in his newspapers the type of stories from a particular slant that he wanted that would influence the public in the preferred direction. And that's partly what happened. Now we get back to Theodore Roosevelt, as one historian has said, a man with daring and a program at this time. Though we're looking at Roosevelt now as a younger man. We started with a quote from his presidency, but during the Spanish American War, he wasn't quite president yet. This is still a few years before that. When the war began, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as you see, which was a more powerful position than it might sound. I asked the question, which we'll come back to, was Roosevelt a warmonger? Many scholars have thought so. We'll deal with it. Roosevelt was one of those political leaders who, he was a rising star, by the way, in this position. So he was already a powerful figure. But as another historian says, this time a biographer of Roosevelt himself, outraged by the president's failure to avenge the Maine, meaning President McKinley didn't take action, at least immediately, and didn't really want to take action, at least military action, to get revenge for the explosion of the Maine. Which, by the way, I skipped that part. Let's go back. The question marks. The Hearst and Pulitzer papers immediately after the explosion of the Maine filled their papers day after day after day with stories of Spanish perfidy and wrongdoing and murder, assuming or just claiming that Spanish troops set off a bomb and blew up the Maine. The truth is, we don't know for sure, although the investigations that were done then and scholarship research since indicates, I think, strongly that it was an accident, that it was a boiler room explosion, actually a faulty, some faulty mechanics in this type of ship, and so it was an accident. But it's a great example of Hearst and Pulitzer's tendency and more to stretch the truth or not care about the truth because they want the story that sells papers. So if the story was the Maine blew up by accident, that would make the news, but it's not going to be as dramatic and sell as many papers and draw as much attention and push more and more Americans to an aggressive stance against Spain. If the story says the Spanish blew up the Maine and killed 266 Americans, that gets Americans' attention and gets them, fired up and emotional, much more so. So this is what Roosevelt was referring to in the President McKinley's failure to avenge the Maine. Roosevelt is reputed to have described McKinley as having, quote, no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. Typical Roosevelt type comment. When his boss, the actual Secretary of Navy, took a day off, Roosevelt issued a flurry of peremptory orders. Ships were redeployed, ammunition ordered, coal requisitioned, and vessels earmarked for purchase. Messages were sent to members of Congress requesting immediate legislation to authorize the enlistment of unlimited numbers of men. Guns were ordered, and on and on. The most far-reaching of these orders was a cable to Commodore Dewey, ordering him to concentrate the ships of the Asian Squadron at Hong Kong. Dewey took immediate steps to make his ships battle-ready. Roosevelt's actions were not impulsive. They were the result of a deliberate plan worked out over some time with Lodge, who we'll meet, Mahan, who we have met, and other members of his expansionist coterie. Lodge was present when Roosevelt prepared the cable to Dewey. Shocked into action by Roosevelt's cyclonic performance, the Navy Department now entered a period of intensified activity. And the next day, when his boss came back to work, he was shocked at everything that Roosevelt had done and probably not happy about it, but didn't fire him, partly because I think he knew Roosevelt had ability and because he had lots of connections, so it wasn't a good idea. But interestingly, he didn't reverse one of Roosevelt's actions. So for whatever reason, he decided I'm going to have to live with this, or maybe he supported it. I don't know. He never came out and praised Roosevelt for it, but he didn't publicly criticize him or fire him either. But it does show that Roosevelt and his allies were already sort of aggressively working, sometimes behind the scenes, to push the country and the president towards war, into war. This brings us to Roosevelt's buddy, a close personal friend, Henry Cabot Lodge, United States Senator from Massachusetts, who was fairly young, as Roosevelt was at the time, but had a storied career in the United States Senate, eventually became Senate Majority Leader in World War II and somewhat beyond. They were fast friends, partly because of their backgrounds. So why did they think so much alike? Partly because of those backgrounds. They both came from extremely wealthy families, extremely, but inherited wealth. So they were old money families. Lodge from Boston, Massachusetts, and Roosevelt from New York City. So they kind of came from patrician backgrounds and had the old money, in some ways snobbish attitude of their class. Though Roosevelt in some ways broke out of it, did this stint doing cowboy work in Montana or Wyoming, I forget where it was. But Lodge was sort of always consistent with his highbrow, somewhat snobbish, manner and approach to politics and values. So that's probably part of the reason they thought so much alike. It might have something to do with their relative youth as well. The large policy, as it was known, was Lodge's attempt in the Senate and the larger Congress to push a more expansionist foreign policy. So large policy really is just another way to say that Lodge was among those internationalists saying the United States must have a more aggressive foreign policy commensurate with its economic growth and power in other ways. But when the crisis came down after the Maine and around Cuba's independence fight, Lodge sort of kicked into high gear with Roosevelt at his side. Metaphorically speaking, although Lodge, I'm kind of confusing my thoughts here, sorry, but Lodge had actually been a mentor to Theodore Roosevelt. They were roughly the same age, but Lodge was a bit more established in his career. But it's an odd relationship because Lodge was the mentor, but Roosevelt was sort of more the star. So, and would sort of rise above him eventually when he became president. So, the following from another book on this conflict, said that he'd broken his silence, long silence on Cuba, right around this time, with a speech on the Senate floor. Before the packed and hushed galleries, Lodge stood trim and erect in his tailored charcoal suit and his high white collar. He took the role of statesman, calling on the Senate and the nation to support going to war. His tone was more sorrowful than angry. Notwithstanding McKinley's, the president, forlorn wish to keep diplomacy alive, negotiations alive, he warned against further negotiations with Spain. We have been wandering too long as a country amid the delusions and snares of diplomacy. Let us now come out into the clear light of day and look the facts squarely in the face, he proclaimed, his grating voice suffused with the moral certainty of his Puritan ancestors. I love the phrasing of Evan Thomas, a noted historical writer. This is from a fairly recent book from a few years back. So Lodge used his skills as an orator and a statesman to sort of make what sounded like a high-minded case for war, the necessity, morally and otherwise, not just practically, to go to war. Whether he actually believed that or not, that's the way he sold it here. I think he believed it to some degree. On the other side, a group that came to be known quickly as the anti-imperialists, opposed to the Spanish American War, but in a more general sense of a more aggressive American foreign policy. So anti-imperialist and isolationists, not always exactly the same, but they're at least cousins. And the two that we'll focus on here are Henry Brackett Reed, not too well known today, though he was a major player in politics at the time. He was the longtime Speaker of the House of Representatives, one of the highest positions in our government, even now. And on the right, William James, not a politician, a professor at Harvard, a writer, a scholarly writer in the fields of philosophy and psychology, hugely influential intellectually in the country. They opposed war. I'm going to skip the quotes below their pictures under Reed's. They're two funny stories that go with that, but I don't have time. But they opposed the war on moral grounds, primarily, both thinking that the war was unnecessary and would bring out the worst in America and Americans. Reed saying, through the words of Thomas, or Thomas saying that he had a keen understanding of the darker side of human nature. He understood and deplored war fever. He was also sensitive to human rights and did not wish to see the U.S. playing the role of the world's policeman, not wanting to do the kind of Roosevelt corollary thing, which actually happened later on, but the same idea. There was plenty of human suffering to attend to at home. Reed had long ridiculed American adventuring. His keen nose smelled hypocrisy in the growing cries of the jingoes who wanted to save Cuba from Spain. Jingoism was a word at the time for extreme patriotism. William James, coming from a similar perspective, sort of thought long and hard about this war and war in general. And as a psychologist slash philosopher, he came to many of his conclusions through a great deal of introspection that he did. Not the only great thinker in history to base sort of much of his thinking on an analysis of himself, but one of the most notable. And he put that to kind of work here. So in part, what we're saying is that William James knew that in his nature was a capacity to sort of get emotionally carried away by war fever and revel in aggression against someone else or another country. And so he knew the feeling in himself and didn't like it. And this is in part what led him to be opposed to aggressive foreign policy, an internationalist foreign policy, and in this case, war with Spain. From the same source, the author says, rather than be passively swept up by the jingoist tide, hypnotized by sacramental phrases, in James' words, of patriotic duty, students, his own and other students, should think for themselves and take action. Action denouncing, quote, a wanton and blustering provocation of war. He was, he knew, trying to treat war fever with a placebo. Reason, he once observed, is one of the very feeblest of nature's resources, saying if we stuck to reason, rational people would not be in favor of this war, but he believed that on these occasions reason doesn't really count for much. It's emotion that counts for more. And to reiterate, he partly knew that, or thought he knew that, because he himself, even as a brilliant Harvard professor and scholar, knew his own capacity to let emotion take over and set reason aside. So he was quite fearful that that's what Americans, both leaders and average people, were succumbing to. Which brings us to the president, William McKinley, and his deceptive blandness, a phrase of one of his biographers, which I love, deceptive blandness. So William McKinley, as president, public opinion, and the intense drumbeat for war. So McKinley is the guy who ultimately made the decision to go to war in 1898, but he was an extremely reluctant war president. Not out of cowardice, but I think he had the same kind of moral and other types of reservations that we saw in anti-imperialists like the two we just dealt with. Excuse me. H.W. Brands again. American investors in Cuba, in the sugar industry, most conspicuously, lobbied Congress for protection for their interests. More broadly, the Depression, remember this is in the middle of the 1890s Depression, caused incumbents to welcome distraction. meaning the author saying that some politicians welcomed distraction away from the Depression that they were sometimes getting blamed for by their constituents. A war would distract Americans from their worries about the Depressions. If we shall have war, Henry Cabot Lodge explained, we will not hear much of the currency question in the elections. Remember, the currency issue was huge at this time, particularly among farmers, the populists. Rebels based in Florida launched numerous raids and supply operations against Cuba from the American shores, prompting complaints from Spain that the U.S. was already intervening in the Cuban War. So with Spain already complaining that the U.S. Was involved, it made it harder to not get involved. By the time McKinley inherited the problem, so all these things had actually been going on before McKinley became president, it was already nearing full boil. And he said, I've been through one war, I've seen the dead pile up, and I do not want to see another. He was talking about the Civil War, which he had been involved in. Yet the advocates of war grew stronger every day. Hearst and Pulitzer brayed loudly for intervention. Whitelaw Reid of the soberer New York Tribune implored the president to act. Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt hissed warlike thoughts in McKinley's ear. Senators from both parties argued vehemently and at length for Cuban freedom. So there were not necessarily a majority, at least until the very end, in both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, pushing for war. I need to clarify something that I didn't before. All of the major players we're talking about here were Republicans, which shows you, again, that the Republican Party, as well as the Democrats, were torn. So the anti-imperialist Speaker of the House, Reed, who we just talked about, was against the war. But he was a fellow Republican and a friend up until this crisis, which saw a break in the friendship, of the pro-war Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, Alfred T. Mahan, and McKinley is a Republican president, so these guys should all be on the same side. But Reed is against the war. Roosevelt and Lodge are in favor of it, and McKinley is waffling and trying to find a way out, but can't seem to do it. So in the end, since he did make the decision, he's the one who finally, did take the country into war, asking Congress for support, which they granted him. But how much is he responsible, since he didn't want to do this and tried to find sort of every way out of it as possible? It's hard to say a president isn't at all responsible. And I'm not saying guilty, because I'm not making a moral judgment on the decision to go to war or not. I'm not saying we can't make that decision, but that's not my job. But was he the most responsible person, or the most responsible element for the war coming about? I'm not going to answer that. I'll leave it hanging there as a rhetorical question. Showing us the power of the anti-imperialists and isolationists in the country, I told you this would be a seesaw battle back and forth between the two for quite some time. As the country was about to go off to war, the anti-imperialists in Congress, with support from all kinds of important leaders, you could see on the right there, not just, I should say, American celebrities, from politicians to editors to writers, etc. Mark Twain, John Dewey, who we'll meet in the next unit, a philosopher, Henry James, an author, William James, his brother, we just talked about, William Graham Sumner, economist, sociologist, so Andrew Carnegie, an industrialist, who we know all about already. All of those people, all of them famous, all of them leaders in American society in one field or another, were on the list of committed anti-imperialists. So for different reasons in some cases, and some of them, again, were more anti-imperialists than they were overall isolationists, but nonetheless, it's partly because of the backing of these guys that their fellow thinkers in Congress, congressmen who were also anti-imperialists, had the ability and the clout to be able to muscle through what's called the Teller Amendment. An amendment here meant this was a rider or an addition to a funding bill. So the anti-imperialists in Congress are taking President McKinley's war bill, meaning an appropriations bill that would pay for war, and saying we're only going to pass this and give you the money for the war if you agree to this amendment, the Teller Amendment. So they slapped this onto the thing, and to get war, Roosevelt and those that supported it, now McKinley, however reluctantly, had no choice but to put this onto the bill. So the Teller Amendment declared that the U.S. had no intention of exercising sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over Cuba. The government and its control of the island were to be left to its people. This unambiguous statement claimed the moral high ground for the U.S. The U.S. would advance under the banner of idealism. Teller, the amendment is named after one guy, the guy who basically authored it. Teller's formula retained independence as a prospect, but independence was to be granted only when Cubans had shown themselves to be capable, in the eyes of American leaders, of course, of managing their own affairs. So even there you can see that the anti-imperialists in Congress and some of their famous supporters on the right of the screen, some of them were fully committed to absolute anti-imperialism. Some of them were playing it a little more politically and carefully, sort of positioning the United States to sort of come out looking good, even while fighting a war. But overall, that being true, that the Teller Amendment was an anti-imperialist statement in the sense that it was, at least formally, on the surface, declaring that the United States was not going to turn Cuba into a formal colony after the war. And indeed it didn't, as we'll see. The red letter question, this time at the bottom: why would a guy like Andrew Carnegie, let's put Sumner aside for now, so we haven't talked about him before, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but why would Carnegie be an anti-imperialist? Why wouldn't he support internationalism? The question is a particularly interesting one, and I think instructive one, because Carnegie, as we know, we should remember, was the king of the steel industry. If any industry stood to make profits from a war, it would be the steel industry, at least in modern warfare, with battleships already around and artillery made of steel, guns made of steel. But Carnegie was against the war. So there are a lot of other possible reasons. It's debatable. But I think it does show us, again, that this long-time assumption by certain historians, Marxist historians particularly, and students or readers of their books and scholarship that agree with them, that make this blanket sort of conclusion that capitalists are always in favor of wars because they make profit off of them. It's not always true. Andrew Carnegie, at least to some degree, there might have been other motivations as well, as I said, but was against an aggressive foreign policy, against the Spanish American War, at least, again, up to a point, for principled reasons. As much of a scoundrel as he may have been in business operations, he did seem to show some capacity for idealistic thinking about the horrors of war. So the Spanish-American War begins, and sometimes known or called today a splendid little war, which came from John Hay, high-ranking official, I believe in a letter to Theodore Roosevelt, but this name stuck. This moniker stuck to Spanish-American War. A splendid little war, as Hay called it. Of course, a war is apt to be more splendid if you don't have to fight in it, as Hay did not. So it certainly seems splendid to Theodore Roosevelt, because Theodore Roosevelt resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to serve in combat in the war. So you see the question, why in the heck did he do that? This guy was a up-and-coming politician in a powerful place as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I said war, I meant Navy. But why would he resign to fight in this war? Especially, he was a rich guy. He was well connected. Before he became a politician, if anybody could have avoided fighting and nobody would have blinked at it, it would have been Theodore Roosevelt. But he volunteered. There's, I think, two ways to look at this. Either of them or both of them are legitimate. One is that Roosevelt was a warmonger, which was a question on our previous slide. I kind of saved it until now. These kind of dovetail into each other. And there's some reason to think that he was, not in a mean-spirited way, but it might not matter. But he seemed to have he did have a fascination with war, and he seemed to have kind of a natural predilection to think war was kind of fun. Like a 12-year-old kid playing, with toy soldiers or something. He always seemed sort of gleeful when talking about war. His sister one time was talking to one of his friends and colleagues before he was president, and the guy was sort of mystified, couldn't understand her brother Theodore's TD, as they called him, thinking on foreign policy and other matters. It seemed rather juvenile to him. And his sister said, you'll have to understand that in many ways my brother's a 10-year-old kid. In many ways, he thinks like a kid. And I think that's one way to sort of see his aggressive desires with regard to American foreign policy and his willingness to actually fight in the war when he was this sort of high-ranking politician already. Because he saw it as fun. And indeed, he served in the war. He did come under fire. The war was short-lived. There weren't that many battles for that long. But he did put himself in danger and showed himself, acquitted himself bravely by all accounts, though he didn't have much experience. So he didn't necessarily do that well, but he, could honestly say that he, showed courage and bravery under fire. But even after the war or during the war, he wrote letters and wrote about it afterwards. You can see a real buoyant, boyish energy about it. Just how wide-eyed he was about the whole experience. How wonderful the experience was. I mean, he saw people die around him. He wrote about killing a Spanish soldier at one point, and he seems to have like a little kid's notion of war. On the other side, I think he can be praised, and that both of these are not mutually exclusive positions. He can be praised for signing up for the war because, as I said, he didn't have to fight in the war. So, as immature as part of his motivation may have been, another part, I think, legitimately, could be said to be his sort of feelings of patriotism and maybe a belief that, wait a minute, if I'm going to support this war and push this war with my powerful position in government, which I did, and send other American soldiers off to into danger, to be killed, shot at, wounded, then I should do the same thing myself, right? If I'm going to be actively involved in bringing about a war, I should put my money where my mouth is, since I think it's necessary. I need to go and be a part of the war as well. He did become an officer rather quickly, though he wasn't. He was sort of the second in command of his unit, not the guy in command. Again, because of his lack of experience and how quickly he got into the military with little training. So the Spanish American War was over almost before it started. Spain by this time was already a European country whose powerful glory days were centuries in the past. So the United States was easily able to overwhelm Spanish forces, which defeated Spain on land and sea in less than a month. And at the very beginning, Commodore Dewey had already taken his naval squadron in Hong Kong and moved into Manila Bay and defeated Spanish forces. Picture you see in the lower left in Manila Bay. And so before even Cuba was attacked, Spanish control of the Philippines was already crumbling by force. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt had, without his boss's knowledge, sent that cable to Commodore Dewey, preparing him for this very thing to happen if a war should actually break out. So it's partly Roosevelt's doing that Manila, controlled by Spain previously, was taken out of Spain's hands at the very beginning of this war, all the way across the Pacific. Remember, both of them are were Spanish colonies. The quote from Professor Rourke, talks about this sort of starting as a humanitarian effort. At least it was thought that way by the American public. But it's important, I think, to deal with this a little bit. It gives us sort of a broader perspective. So this war began as for a humanitarian cause, free Cuba from Spain's colonial rule, and ended with the United States itself acquiring territory overseas and fighting a dirty guerrilla war with Filipino nationalists who, like the Cubans, sought independence. We'll get to that later. Behind the contradiction, meaning the contradiction that the United States is fighting for Cuba to be free, and then sort of acquiring an empire of its own in the process. Behind the contradiction stood the twin pillars of American foreign policy. One, the Monroe Doctrine made Spain's presence in Cuba unacceptable, and the U.S. determination to keep open the door to Asia, number two, made the Philippines attractive as a stepping stone to China. So there were larger strategic reasons to take the Philippines from Spain as part of this war. Precedent for the nation's imperial adventures also came from the recent Indian Wars in the American West, which we've talked about, of course, in previous unit, which provided a template for the subjugation of native peoples in the name of civilization. So Professor Rourke, our beloved textbook author, you probably feel all warm and fuzzy about Rourke by now in the class, but what he's saying here is that the U.S. was already sort of well acquainted with fighting wars, sort of claiming, we're civilizing the people that we're conquering, while acting with naked aggression, with their experience doing the same thing with Native Americans, in America itself. So this wasn't, in some ways, then a totally new experience. You could see, and maybe we should see, the wars with Native Americans going back decades before this as foreign policy itself and imperialism itself. Another amendment came on the backside of the war. Teller Amendment before the war, right as it was getting started, and the Platt Amendment passed in 1901, going into effect in 1902, to retire and still maintain moral control. As one leader, I think it was Elihu Root, Secretary of Defense or War, who said that. So we'll get to the question afterwards. What was the Platt Amendment? The Teller Amendment, remember, had been pushed successfully, attached to an appropriations war bill that forced the United States by law not to turn Cuba into a formal colony. The Platt Amendment in some ways overturned that, although that wasn't its, I think, overall objective, but it had that effect. A.G. Hopkins, who I've quoted a number of times already, says the remaining problem, how to secure foreign investment in an independent state, was solved by the Platt Amendment, which transformed the ties of intimacy and strength into bonds of steel. The amendment, which was presented to Congress by Senator Orville Platt, but drafted by Elihu Root, Secretary of War, ensured that Cuba's independence would be greatly circumscribed. So the Platt Amendment is now famous for its granting Cuba its formal independence, but sort of writing the amendment in a way that gave the United States an immense amount of control of the country, even though it had independence. And this gets us to the red letter question, wasn't this informal empire? And I think the clear answer to that is yes. Right? The United States is not turning Cuba into a formal colony. It gets its independence, it has its own government, its own president, its own currency, its own flag, its own civil servants, bureaucrats, and yet the United States is still finding ways to manipulate and control. So who got the upper hand in this war? The expansionists, the internationalists, or the isolationists? It's hard to say because it kind of cuts both ways. Wilfred Maclay, who I've quoted before, says, when a Cuban constitution was drafted in 1900, the Platt Amendment to a military appropriations bill passed by Congress was devised to restrict the independence of the new government. It forced the Cubans to acknowledge the U.S. right to intervene in Cuba whenever it deemed necessary, quote, for the preservation of Cuban independence. It is not hard to understand why the Cubans, after having fought a long war, to free themselves of Spanish rule deeply resented these impositions, and that's putting it mildly. So Cuba got its formal independence and ended up in some ways still shackled to the United States. You see in the cartoon there, political cartoon, which is I include a lot of cartoons because in this era, in this war, they're particularly good political cartoons, usually mocking U.S. Foreign policy. So Uncle Sam, right, through a megaphone blaring to the European countries across the Atlantic, the U.S. wants a sovereign, which means free Cuban nation. And they're saying that, right, while he has the guy on shackles, a Cuban, a guy on his knees, with a to-do list. So this is the way, certainly the Cubans saw it, but apparently at least one, political cartoon writer, I don't know who it was, thought the same thing. Plenty of Americans did as well, mainly isolationists / anti-imperialists. So another big part of this expansive American foreign policy had to do with the Caribbean basin and dollar diplomacy. One historian stealing the phrase from another historian, just changing the name, but dollar diplomacy in the process of turning the Caribbean basin into an American lake, meaning American controlled. Caribbean basin, as you can see from the map at the bottom right, is not just the Caribbean islands, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, but also Central America, Nicaragua, and such. So dollar diplomacy has to do with the degree to which American foreign policy, diplomacy, as well as military intervention was connected to corporate interests. That the corporate interests were supported and backed up by military might, U.S. military prowess. That's often been true. It's not specific to this time period, time and place. Secretaries of State, right? Secretary of State, their position then and now is to be the main, the primary American official dealing with foreign policy, and they know when they take the job, they always have, that one of their main jobs is to promote and protect American corporate and business interests overseas, which sounds scandalous, and in some ways it is, but it is the way the world works, whether we like it or not. Governments tend to go to bat for their big corporations because they do see it, right or wrong, true or not true, as important for the national security of the country and for the economic success, well-being, standard of living of the populace. So one of the authors says the U.S. had greater influence in smaller states that were closer to home, meaning closer than the Philippines or Hawaii, which is involved in this as well, particularly those in Central America. They were attractive precisely because, being independent, they did not arouse the degree of opposition that curtailed expatriate enterprise in the formal empire. Meaning these weren't formal colonies because they were independent, right? They didn't attract as much attention in the press, both at home, from foreign governments abroad, and by the peoples of the countries of Central America who don't know as much about it. As we said at the outset today when we talked about sort of the definition of informal empire. Once invested, U.S. companies invariably committed Washington to intervene when business plans went awry. The U.S. took control of the Dominican Republic's finances after a New York firm, the San Domingo Improvement Company, had improved, in quotes, the country enough to the point where it faced bankruptcy. The U.S. decision to occupy Haiti in 1915 was motivated partly by apprehension that Germany and France might secure naval bases there, but also by appeals from the National City Bank of New York, which had invested heavily in the island and was anxious to consolidate and reschedule the state's debts. The United Fruit Company, formed in 1899, which became the largest foreign employer of labor in Central America in the 1920s, not the 1920s, helped to draw in U.S. military support for its operations in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala. This company will come back in a later unit. The main beneficiaries of dollar diplomacy then were a handful of U.S. banks and a few large corporations and contractors. So dollar diplomacy, which is a pithy phrase, shows itself here to be quite accurate in many ways. President Roosevelt, now we're moving forward back to his presidency again. He had been Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, I should say, in the Spanish American War, but became president in 1901 after, I don't know if you knew this or not, William McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt had been his vice president by that time, so Roosevelt started his presidency because of the assassination of the previous president. He was elected in his own right in 1904, so by the time of these events, he'd already been elected as president. He's famous for his big stick diplomacy, as he called it. He's reputed to have said, this phrase is extremely famous now, speak softly and carry a big stick, which we won't sort of get into, but he's saying we have to sort of do things subtly. We can't just go around bludgeoning everybody over the head with a stick all the time, so we should always try for sort of the more peaceful way of doing things, a more careful way of doing things. But if push comes to shove and those things don't work, you better have a powerful weapon, at hand. The Great White Fleet, as it became known, was the American Navy, and it made a circumnavigation of the globe, an around the world voyage, which you can see in the map, roughly, barely in the upper right. Roosevelt had always been fascinated by ships and the Navy. Again, that kind of little kid's fascination. Partly why he loved being Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He liked to watch ships go out, or liked to watch from the shores the ships were out, sort of on exercise off the coastline, practicing firing their guns in the United States, not at the United States, but in the United States. But he believed firmly, and some of this came from his buddy Alfred Mahan's book, which he read as soon as it came out, and they became fast friends because of it. But in the importance of naval power. He said himself in the bottom left, the United States must either build and maintain an adequate navy or make up their minds to accept a secondary position in international affairs. So he's saying that we either have to build a big navy or just relegate ourselves to being sort of a none too powerful country in the world. We're not going to be at the top without a navy. Burns, one of our experts on American imperialism, says, even before rising to the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt subscribed to a large policy, which again was Lodge's policy, remember they're friends and colleagues on the same side, that aimed to bring, as Republicans, the United States onto a par with European nations in terms of military and strategic presence across the globe. Became convinced that for the U.S., to project power effectively, it required a large navy. Because the U.S. was a transcontinental nation with imperial possessions in both the Pacific and the Caribbean, a naval force capable of patrolling 2 oceans was required to realize his vision. So he, again, pushed through a much stronger navy. It may have doubled in size by the time he was gone. Certainly expanded by a great deal. The Great White Fleet, which made its circumnavigation in 1907, was 16 battleships that toured the world. And as I say, as our question at the top, what was the point? Why send battleships, 16 of them, all the way around the world? They were kind of divided into 2 squadrons of 8. They didn't shoot at anybody. They didn't fight a war. There was no war the U.S. was fighting at that point. But it made all these stops. You can kind of see the little points of where they stopped around the world. What was the point in stopping at these points? Pardon the play on words there. But it was in a way for the United States to kind of flex its muscles, sort of show off its fleet and show off its military naval power. It was a goodwill tour, technically, but the goodwill, again, you didn't have to say to the countries that you're visiting, the ports that you're stopping in with 16 or 8 battleships, that hey, we could blow you to smithereens with these ships. You didn't have to say that. You could smile and be nice and kind and polite. Hey, we're on a goodwill tour because the ship's guns are in the harbor, pointed, at the country, the city that you've stopped in. So this is in a way to kind of intimidate with a smile on your face, which in a sense is what sort of speak softly with a big stick is all about. So Roosevelt certainly isn't the first leader in world history to think of sort of making this kind of statement, about military power without actually firing a shot. Roosevelt also is well known. This might be his claim to fame as president, though there are a lot of other things we could say that in his presidency that could compete with that. But his initiation, at least of the American role in building the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1913. There was already one being built by the French back in the 1880s and beyond. The United States stepped in about in the last 10 years and finished the project, but was the key mover in doing so. The canal in the end was 51 miles long. Again, completed in 1913. You can see in both pictures, left and right, photographs, the extraordinary engineering achievement that this canal, was and required. On the left, you see locks, basically doors, that huge ones, structural steel that are shut sort of in front and behind a ship, and this allowed the ships to be raised, elevated, essentially to kind of go uphill. They'd be sealed into a watertight compartment with these huge locks on either side, and then water would be pumped in from below, would lift the ship up. Then one of the locks in front of it would open, move into the next lock, and the same thing would happen. Lifting, more water would be put in, and lifting the ship uphill. So these were extraordinary engineering achievements for the time. I mean, there were many elements to this, so multiple engineering achievements in one canal. So impressive from that standpoint alone. Why was the canal so important? We'll come back to it. As Adam Burns says, TR, Theodore Roosevelt's most notable achievement in some ways was to push through the Panama Canal. That meant softening up with cash the corrupt and venal government of Colombia, which owned the Panama Isthmus. TR connived a local conspiracy to set up a separate state of Panama, separate government, recognized by the U.S. government in November of 1903. A new treaty was quickly put through with the new Panamanian government, giving the U.S. control of the canal zone in return for U.S. support of the new country. So in a sense, not completely, Panama, as a province of Colombia, had already been involved in a movement for independence from the mother country, from the larger country. But Roosevelt certainly capitalized on that problem by supporting Panama. And then the United States, through Roosevelt's policy, was partially responsible for Panama becoming its own separate country, because U.S. support certainly helped them. But Roosevelt did it primarily to get something back out of the deal, which was control of the canal zone, which was done for decades. The United States only turned the canal zone back over to Panama a couple dozen years ago. So it hasn't been that long that the United States hasn't actually had troops, a constant presence, permanent presence in the canal. So why was the canal so important? It may be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. This was of strategic value, big time. Remember that for ships to get from the East Coast to the West Coast, or vice versa, before this, they had to go all the way around the tip of South America and back up again. So for both military and economic reasons, the Panama Canal, which cuts the trip, in half or less than half, is of tremendous importance. This is why the United States made sure they controlled the canal for decades and decades. until they thought it was safe to put it back into the control of the hands of Panama. It's not as, I think, important today because of improvements in technology and transportation, etc. But it's still somewhat important. But at the time, it was of strategic importance, of the utmost strategic importance. It also shows us that the United States was an imperial power in a different way. Right? The U.S. can lean on other smaller countries and get sort of big things done. This is a big accomplishment, but done by pushing other countries around. In this case, Colombia, kind of pushing it out of the way, and in a sense, manipulating Panama, a new country, at the same time, and yet of enormous strategic benefit. So, assessing the American empire as a whole in a roughly 30-year period, we mostly focused on the events just before 1900. But we can see in the map on the right, there was a map from the time, at the time. So this would be certainly not considered okay today. The wording of this today, it's very pro-imperialist, very rah-rah American aggressive foreign policy here. But it's kind of simple and clear. And it does show you the thinking, at least in the internationalist circles in America. But this already then was a pretty expansive empire, even though a lot of it's on small islands. But you can sort of see them there, which eventually includes Panama, you see in the lower right, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, and on and on. And all that Professor Burns, who wrote American Imperialism, which, by the way, is the American Imperialism is the book that I sometimes use as a supplementary text in class. The Spanish American War annexations provide annexation again means taking formal control, provide the leading examples of American imperialism. The effects of these annexations were far from temporary. Cuba might have gained its imperfect independence in 1902. Yet even there, the issue of Guantanamo Bay provides a lasting reminder of U.S. imperialism. The Philippines fought a long and bitter guerrilla war against the U.S., and their politicians campaigned for decades before finally achieving their independence in 1946. In Puerto Rico, of course, the mantle of U.S. empire lives on, despite dividing public opinion there to this day. Yet the Spanish-American War annexations were not the end of such overseas territorial aggrandizement, and the same Caribbean and Pacific theaters continued to see further U.S. imperialist interventions throughout the first decades of the 20th century and beyond. The latter sentence they're talking apart about the things going on in the Caribbean Basin and Central America. So aggrandizement means sort of aggressive activity. So this final quote that I use here kind of brings everything up to the present, showing that some of these issues are still around today. Guantanamo Bay was first acquired from Cuba as sort of a price of the United States helping to free them from Spanish rule. But the Cubans didn't have a choice, and it's American territory even now. So a lot of these things are long-term issues. Puerto Rico is not a state, but it's a possession of the United States. You may know, it's not that not knowledge is that widespread, so maybe you don't. But Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens who can vote in America and do vote in American elections, even though it's not a state. There's been a movement for a long time to make Puerto Rico the 51st state here and in Puerto Rico. But there's something else about empire that's, I think, this quote is nice to help conclude with, and that is that, Puerto Rico is, in a sense, part of American empire today. We took it by force, take away from Spain. I didn't cover that part of it for reasons of time, but during this whole Spanish-American conflict. So in that sense, the empire lives on. Puerto Rico doesn't have a choice but to be connected to the United States. We're not asking them. We've forced them in and kept them for it. Despite, as it says, dividing public opinion there to this day. So here's the question, which is, again, back to our red letter questions. How do we come to terms with these events? Well, it's difficult to. But that's the point, is imperialism, empire, is not easy to make facile, blanket conclusions about one way or the other, good or evil, which is basically true of history in general, but certainly true here. And we can see this in the fact that Puerto Ricans themselves are divided to this day. So I'm not telling you or anyone else what to think about American empire. Again, I don't see that as my job. You can think, what you like about it, and a case can be made on either side that it was a good thing, a bad thing, and yet the people of Puerto Rico themselves are debating it even now. Right? Roughly half of the public there wants to stay alongside and with and even become a part of the United States. And the other half basically has been fighting for a long time to declare and achieve independence. But why would half or close to half want to stay with the United States when it was acquired through imperialistic warfare? It's an interesting question, and I'm not, again, proposing to answer it for you, but it's one of the ways we can come to terms with these events. Thank you.